Thank you again for joining us for this webinar on President Trump's nuclear arms challenges and the dangers ahead. The Pulitzer Center is pleased to present this session with our partners from Outrider Foundation and the Bulletin of the Atomic Scientist, as well as the Carnegie Corporation of New York. I'm excited to introduce our panelists for today's conversation. Rachel Oswald is CQ Roll Call's foreign policy reporter. She's a 3-time reporting grant recipient from the Pulitzer Center and a past fellow of the International Reporting Project, the Japan Foreign Press Center, and the National Endowment for Democracy. Rachel also serves as the chair of the National Press Club's Press Freedom Committee. Her reporting has taken her to Japan, South Korea, Taiwan, Russia, and Kazakhstan, among other countries. Scott Sagan is also with us today. Scott is the co-director and senior fellow of the Center for International Security and Cooperation at Stanford University. Scott serves as chairman of the American Academy of Arts and Sciences Committee on International Security Studies. Before joining the Stanford faculty, Scott was a lecturer in the Department of Government at Harvard and served as a special assistant to the director of the Organization of the Joint Chiefs of Staff in the Pentagon. Everyone, please feel free to start adding in your questions via the Q&A icon for our panelists at any time throughout their conversation. And now I'd like to hand the mic over to Rachel for you to begin today's discussion with Scott.
Great, thanks, Anne. So the Bulletin of the Atomic Scientist announced on Tuesday that it is moving its clock 1 second closer to midnight. This is the closest humanity has ever been to a catastrophic event that would imperil all of humanity. So from the Bulletin's announcement, in making and announcing this decision, they said, with regard to nuclear risk, the war in Ukraine, now in its 3rd year, looms over the world. The conflict could become nuclear at any moment because of a rash decision or through an accident or miscalculation. Conflict in the Middle East threatens to spiral out of control into a wider war without warning. The countries that possess nuclear weapons are increasing the size and role of their arsenals, investing hundreds of billions of dollars in weapons that can destroy civilization. The nuclear arms control process is collapsing, and high-level contacts among nuclear powers are totally inadequate given the danger at hand. Alarmingly, it is no longer unusual for countries without nuclear weapons to consider developing arsenals of their own, actions that would undermine long-standing non-proliferation efforts and increase the ways in which nuclear war could start. That was from the Bulletin. So Scott, since you were involved in the decision to move the clock 1 second closer to midnight, can you talk a little bit about how that decision was made and the processes behind it that you and your fellow deliberators used?
Sure, happy to do that. And let me first just thank you, Rachel, and thank the Center and the Outrider Foundation for organizing this event. The Bulletin set its clock 1 second closer to midnight through a process that the Science and Security Board, a group of social scientists and physical scientists who meet twice a year and have intense debates about where's the world heading. And we set the clock, as the Bulletin has done for decades now, based not on a prediction about what's going to happen over the next year, but what has happened over the past year. Has the world gotten safer, or has it gotten more dangerous? And the judgment, a consensus judgment, is that it's gotten slightly more dangerous. That's partly due to climate change problems. Every day that we don't get better at dealing with climate problems, the world is getting hotter. Not doing anything just makes this problem worse. And the climate scientists in the group, one reminded us that while it is true that this past year was the hottest year in recorded history, from a longer perspective for our children, this past year may be the coldest year that they will have in their future. And that is a remarkable way of thinking about the dangers we face on climate. As you noted on nuclear issues, it's a more mixed view because there still is an arms control agreement between the Russians and the Americans, but it lapses next year, and there's no process of negotiation to renew or to have a new process. Iran has gotten closer to getting nuclear weapons. When the first Trump administration pulled out of the JCPOA, the Joint Comprehensive Plan of Action, they said that they're going to get a better agreement, but that has not happened. And the only result has been that Iran's gotten much closer to getting nuclear weapons. And I would just add that on top of that, there's the problem of China, which has been building up its arsenal and has refused to enter into any kinds of negotiations with the United States about having an arms control between the United States and the Chinese government. Two new developments just in this past week. One is that President Trump at Davos did at least state that we spend a lot on nuclear weapons and that he hopes that there can be denuclearization between Russia, China, and the United States. Now, whether that will actually turn into something, we don't know. And then second, they announced a Iron Dome for America program, demanding that the Pentagon put together a plan to deploy, not just design and think through, but to deploy missile defenses far beyond anything that we have, but including space-based interceptors and including preemptive capabilities to destroy other sides' nuclear weapons on the ground before they can be launched. So we're in for a very rocky road, in my judgment. And I think the decision of the board just to move the clock a little bit closer to midnight was a sign that everybody on that committee was afraid.
It's pretty troubling. I'm speaking here from Washington, D.C. We're less than 2 weeks into the second Trump administration, and it has been a very turbulent beginning. And I mean, some of new administrations, there's always a little bit of turbulence, chaos, particularly when it's a new party coming into power. But the level of change feels unprecedented, including even when you compare the change in 2017 from Obama to Trump 1.0. So one of the things I'm looking at, including from the nuclear weapons realm, is what you spoke a little bit about this, Scott, about these initial actions by the president, this issuing of the executive order, and then some of his rhetoric around his openness, both as a candidate during the transition and then now as president to negotiations that may or may not be about arms control with Russia, but also other countries, China, North Korea, Iran. I mean, what do you think about, I think, maybe some of the openness of President Trump when it comes to considering ways to reach deals?
Well, I personally think Donald Trump has a quite strong hand now. With respect to Iran, for example, not only has Israel shown a capability to shoot down Iranian missiles, but Israel has destroyed two of Iran's greatest allies in Hezbollah and Hamas, or at least severely weakened them. So I think Iran may be more open to a renewed deal than it was under the last in the last few years. Whether the Trump administration wants a new deal or whether it's willing to get a new deal and whether it's capable is another matter. I personally think that President Trump would love to get a Nobel Peace Prize, to say that Barack Obama is not the only president who got a Nobel Peace Prize. Look, I got one too.
Mhm.
And therefore, he does have incentives, I think, to be a peacemaker and to be a deal maker. He would like to do that.
Yeah.
What we also know, however, is that I think, laudable efforts to try to get a deal in the first administration with North Korea failed utterly. And they failed utterly not because they were poorly conceived. Indeed, the State Department had put together a step-by-step approach that potentially could have gotten a deal with North Korea, a gradual release of aid so that there would be sanctions relief in exchange for gradual changes, more openness, and more restrictions on their nuclear program. But President Trump, at the very last minute, in the negotiation with Kim Jong-un, as one official who was there put it, he called an audible. He changed the game plan and decided we're going to go for broke and he's got to get rid of his entire program immediately. Kim Jong-un was shocked when Donald Trump walked out of the negotiations and was embarrassed to go back home without anything. So it's not clear whether North Korea will be willing to go into another negotiation. So I think that we've got an opportunity here potentially to have more arms control or potentially have some agreements on non-proliferation. I would love it if the hand could move back next year, but the past is quite alarming.
I agree. What about Russia? You mentioned earlier that the New START agreement is going to expire in February 2026. Russia has already kind of ended part of its participation in the treaty on the verification measure side, but so far we think the limits imposed by the treaty on long-range deployed nuclear weapons are holding. But it sounds like this could be part of a broader negotiation that could include Ukraine. Certainly, Vladimir Putin has said he wants Ukraine to be part of talks with the US, but kind of exclude Ukraine from that. So it's a direct negotiation between the US and Russia on nuclear weapons and the fate of Ukraine. President Joe Biden wasn't interested in that. He said Ukrainians will decide for Ukraine, and he wanted to keep the nuclear talks separate from Ukraine. But President Trump might be more interested in some kind of big deal. I think looking at it could get very complicated because the Ukrainians, President Zelensky of Ukraine has said that if Ukraine isn't allowed into NATO, then Ukraine wants a nuclear weapon. And he's since kind of walked back that comment he made last year, and his government has also tried to walk it back. But the Ukrainian people, I think over 70% of them are very interested in a nuclear weapon, and this is a country that during the Soviet Union had nuclear weapons and then gave them up as part of what was called the Budapest Memorandum with the US and Russia agreeing to respect Ukrainian sovereignty. And then we all know how that happened, how that fell out for the Ukrainians. So I think arms talks, peace talks, that's going to be a huge issue. And I wonder when the talks could begin. I think they're still kind of figuring out the terrain as Trump gets his team in place. What are your thoughts?
I think there's a sad irony here. The risk of first use of nuclear weapons by Russia was, I think, very serious in 2022 when Russia was losing after the initial campaigns faltered and Ukraine was pushing it back. That's when Vladimir Putin threatened to use nuclear weapons, claiming that there was a precedent for using a limited number of nuclear weapons to end a war, citing Hiroshima and Nagasaki by name. The CIA, according to reporting, issued a warning inside the US government saying that the likelihood of nuclear weapons use had gone way up. And in response to that, the Biden administration put together, I think, a large team effort to warn the Russians that you may think that you have more at stake in the war in Ukraine than we do. You might be right, but we have something at stake as important as anything that you have with making sure that nuclear weapons aren't used again. And that if you use nuclear weapons, the purported threat was that the United States would get directly involved with conventional arms and that Russian forces in Ukraine, potentially in the Black Sea, would be destroyed. Now, that was an escalation if the reporting is accurate, in the US threat to get involved, but a de-escalation, because unlike past nuclear strategies, it wasn't saying we will follow tit for tat, we will do the same thing. I think it was a wise policy for the Biden administration to put together. Now, the sad irony right now is that the potential Russian use of nuclear weapons has gone down in Ukraine because Russia is being more successful, and that the risk of nuclear war goes up when Russia feels like it is losing a conventional war. So I hope that there is a peace, but it would be a negotiated peace. And I hope that Donald Trump doesn't give in to Vladimir Putin's desire for a complete success, because that would decrease the risk right now, but it would increase the risk of future Russian invasions, either of Ukraine or of other neighbors. In the case of the Baltic states, would be a NATO member, and that would increase the risk. So I think that the next year is going to be extremely important, and it's going to be a test of the Trump administration's negotiation skills.
Mm-hmm. I guess a little less near term, China. China has been rapidly increasing its nuclear weapons arsenal. The Pentagon, in its annual report to Congress on China's military, I think it found that they had added 100 nuclear weapons in 1 year to their stockpile, and they were on track to reach 1,000 warheads by 2030. For comparison, Russia and the US each have about 5,000, give or take. So that would significantly kind of change what had been since the Cold War, really an arms race or a nuclear dynamic with two main powers to now becoming multipolar, right? We've never done that before. I think I think one of the reasons Chinese President Xi Jinping is working so quickly to get these nuclear weapons is it wants, to be at the table with Russia and the US. And maybe with Russia is the right word to say. But at the same time, Beijing has said that they are interested in a treaty, a grand treaty of all the nuclear weapons powers, where each country would pledge to never be the first one to use nuclear weapons. The US does not have such a policy. It would be a very big change for the nuclear weapons culture of the US to go to that policy. But what do you think? Is that out of this realm? I mean, are there just too many reasons in the US nuclear weapons culture to continue to be like, no, we're never going to agree to no first use? Or maybe with President Trump being such a different kind of thinker, to say the least, is this now possible in a way it wasn't before?
Well, I make a couple comments about China and then about no first use. I think what you said was extremely interesting. We don't know what the Trump administration's policy will be regarding China. We do know that people speaking on behalf of the Trump campaign during the election campaign commented that the United States should have as many nuclear weapons as each China and Russia, and therefore we'd have to have more than either of them. Now, if you wanted to match two other countries, it means that you'd likely have a capability to attack that other country, potentially in a destabilizing manner. In my view, a three-way arms race cannot be won and should never be raced. So that's why people are interested in potentially having some kind of three-way arms control agreement. The architecture for that has not been thought through. The Davos comment was the one positive thing, saying that when Trump recognized how much money this is costing, and he wanted to have some kind of potential way of negotiating. The Chinese thus far have said they won't go to the negotiation table until they've caught up with us in terms of numbers. So that's going to be decided over in the next year or two. No first use. I've written articles arguing why the United States should move towards a no first use policy, but I wouldn't say the main constraint is one of culture, as you put it. I think it's a concern that if we said that we would never use nuclear weapons first, even in a limited manner, a number of our allies who are fearful of Russian or Chinese invasion would feel that they need their own nuclear weapons. And so while I personally have advocated a no first use policy as a way of reducing tension, I think the greatest trade-off here is that the Poles or the Japanese or the South Koreans, seeing the United States move in that direction, would think that they're being abandoned. Now, I know you've done lots of reporting on South Korea, Rachel, so maybe you can report on their views about no first use and their views about their own nuclear weapons, because I think what you've been doing there is really, really interesting.
Well, thanks, Scott. And I would certainly be interested in revisiting that reporting and also revisiting reporting with other U.S. allies about the six and the nuclear umbrella. I'm thinking now, just listening to you talk, that you and I are kind of like very, very in the weeds on this stuff, given our day jobs. And for people who this is not their day job and they're relatively new to this, I'm trying to think about what table setting would be good for the audience, particularly where we went from the high point in, what was it, 2010, 2011, when President Obama got the Nobel. And there really did seem like there was this strong international enthusiasm for finally, negotiating away nuclear weapons, and there was going to be a nuclear ban treaty, all of these things. And now here we are, 15 years later, and the pendulum is
It's worse.
the
It's
other
gotten
way.
much worse.
It's much worse. It's much worse. And we've got countries are very nervously, they don't want. I mean, and I think this is kind of this can be this is a dynamic that's good to explore, why you can have some countries which are very liberal in their policies elsewhere, and are much more anti-military intervention than say the US historically has been. But they quietly are like, we want you to keep the nuclear umbrella. At the same time, members of Trump's inner circle are talking about, we need to rethink our extended nuclear deterrence promises. You've got folks like Bridge Colby, who's been nominated to be the Undersecretary of Defense for Policy. He hasn't yet been confirmed, but I suspect he will be. He has talked about how he wants the US to kind of refocus on China as the big main threat and do a lot less for the Ukrainians, but also a lot less for the South Koreans, and kind of leave it up to the South Koreans to take care of themselves on the Korean Peninsula. That's one voice. But J.D. Vance as well is somebody who wants to focus away from Europe and more toward China. And it's not yet clear how all those voices in the mix, including, with people like Secretary of State Marco Rubio, who is more from like the traditional, I guess, mold of a military internationalist the Republican Party has been known for since, the mid 20th century, how that's all, what that is all going to boil up to, because while a lot of this does come from President Trump, there's just so many issues that require staff and high level staff to work. It's unclear what this soup is all going to be resulting in. But on the South Korea front, I think it is very interesting because, I think there you also have 70% public support for nuclear weapons. The South Korean President Yoon is not going to be, he's being impeached, and in the process, I think he will soon be out of office. And I think it was his party that was more interested in nuclear weapons. But one of the things my reporting in South Korea back in 2018 revealed was, sometimes it's younger South Koreans that are interested in nuclear weapons too. So the breakages there are not necessarily what you would assume if you're looking at it from like a background of American issues and what goes to supporting certain ideas about peace and war and militarism and budgets. But I think there's a lot of areas to watch. I mean, we're talking right now about our allies, but then even in our not so formal allies, we could be soon having an agreement with Saudi Arabia. I mean, we could
Certainly,
talk about that a little
certainly
bit.
if
We're not there yet,
If
but
Iran moves forward with a nuclear weapon, I think you're going to see developments in Saudi Arabia. The Saudis have said that they're going to seek nuclear weapons if Iran is permitted. And if Iran does make a decision to move forward, it's not clear whether the Israelis and or the United States would attack. My suspicion is that that would happen and it would set back the program, but it would only set it back by a few years because the Iranians have had time to disperse their materials and their capabilities to produce more materials.
yep.
So I think what is constraining Israel today is a hope that Iran could be kept in place without a bomb and a fear that if they did attack Iran, that it would not be as effective as, for example, the uh, Israeli attack that destroyed the Iraqi reactor or the one that destroyed the Syrian reactor. Iran's way too developed to be able to go that route.
The know-how is in the minds of their scientists. They would have to have a program of just one by one eliminating all the scientists who know it, and it's too diffuse, as you said.
Yeah.
Um,
So I think we're beyond that, and the best hope is for a diplomatic outcome, and that would be in the Trump administration's interest if they could get one that is successful. You earlier mentioned the war in Ukraine, and I think there is a connection here, in that the Trump administration the first time around was pretty strongly anti-NATO. And there are many in NATO today who have great concerns about what the future relationship will be of the United States to NATO because they see the trends in the Republican Party under Trump's influence. So will they seek their own nuclear arsenal relying on the French and the British? Or will they keep the current policy, which is that the United States has a very small number of nuclear weapons on a number of countries in NATO's soil, and has pledged that an attack on one is an attack on all, and that all options are on the table. Now, it's just not clear what the Trump administration's policy will be to NATO, but in my last few trips to Europe, people were very, very nervous because they know that Trump is mercurial at best.
Yes, yes. Yeah, and the dynamics with nuclear burden sharing in NATO, they could also have a significant shift, particularly, you know, European NATO countries really felt destabilized by Trump 1.0 and his threats to not come to their defense. The US would not come to their defense if they didn't increase their defense spending. We don't know how it's all going to shake out with this second administration, but there has been just so much reporting and analysis coming from Europe that Europeans feel like the US is not a reliant partner. The re-election of President Trump really I think strengthen that belief that while the U.S. might have presidents who are very transatlantic, like President Joe Biden, there's always the chance of another isolationist type president coming up, and that it's too dangerous for them to rely on the U.S. for their security. Um, Honestly, that might not be a bad thing. That might not be a bad thing, for Europeans to get better at defending themselves, but the nuclear proliferation concerns are real. France and the UK could possibly work something out. They don't have a history of doing that, but I mean, who knows? Meanwhile, the UK is in a tri-party security cooperation agreement with Australia. And I don't even know if we could get into that, but there's just the way these new security groupings are forming. It's all, I mean, foreign policy covering it has never been more thrilling and exhausting and bewildering. You know, it's all at once. What's happening in the Middle East, what might happen with Israel, what might happen with Saudi Arabia, with United Arab Emirates. These are all nuclear weapons countries or countries that are interested in nuclear weapons. Um, uh, it's all a lot.
It's bewildering and it's alarming. And I would just add one further thought here, to add even more concern. Yeah, I'm a reluctant believer in nuclear deterrence. I think that nuclear deterrence has not been perfect. It's still extremely risky, but it also has an effect. People in leadership positions are concerned about their legacy and are concerned about the possibility that a conventional war could turn into a nuclear war, and that can be a constraint.
Mhm.
That said, nuclear deterrence, people will often say, requires extreme rationality. I don't think that's quite right. Deterrence doesn't require rationality, it requires a checks and balances system so that if an irrational leader makes a rash decision, others can oppose it. And that's why I worry about dictators with nuclear weapons, because they can make rash decisions based on bad information, based on misconceptions, based on false warnings, and no one will correct them. I think that's the danger that you see in Vladimir Putin, which is why he's such a dangerous leader. People couldn't tell him or wouldn't tell him that this attack on Ukraine will be a disaster for us. Instead, he surrounded himself with yes men. I worry about this in China today, but I must say, and this I say with a bit of trepidation, I think President Trump has a wannabe dictator style to him. He likes to surround himself with yes men, and he likes to punish anyone who disagrees with him. So it is worrisome to me that the current president of the United States, even if he behaves in a rational manner, can lash out, can be vindictive, or could make a decision based on false warning or false information, and that we need to have people surrounding him who are willing to put up guardrails. That's not an easy thing to do with this president.
Mhm. Is there anybody who you think is in his circle who can be that voice of reason and I mean maybe they would be kicked to the curb, maybe they wouldn't.
Well, I think what you saw in the first Trump administration were a series of military officers who were willing to stand up, either current military officers like General McMaster or recently retired officers like Secretary of Defense James Mattis. Um, I think there are fewer of those around President Trump now because he has signaled to those people that I don't like it when you disagree with me, when you stand up with me, or when you do what they often did was slow roll the president to say, "Oh, yes, sir, we'll do that," and then not do it in the end. A good president sometimes will make a rash choice, and a good advisor will know that you don't want to follow that. You want to come back the next day and when the person's calmed down. But Trump doesn't seem to want people around him who will do that to him, and that's deeply troubling.
So then that brings me to what I'm thinking. I have been thinking about bandwidth, right? We've just talked about so much crises and potential crises from Russia, North Korea, Iran, China, other things in the Middle East, proliferation concerns that we don't even know about yet. How can the administration have the bandwidth to handle so many crises at once. We saw with the Biden administration that their bandwidth was really tested. There were some legitimate crises, like including what's happening in Sudan, that just did not get enough high-level administration attention because they were so focused on what was going on in Ukraine and what was going on in Israel, Gaza. You know, some people say the US can really only do one big thing at once. Other people will disagree, say, no, we can do lots of things. My experience as a foreign policy reporter is that they can do one thing really well, and then a couple of other things pretty good, especially if they're not crises and the terrain is very well understood, like working with really trusted allies, you know, which is the Australia-UK thing. That thing could kind of continue going along because there was a lot of trust and people weren't going to rush to break things. But what about, we just don't know. We don't know what these next 4 years are going to predict happen around the world.
The US government is filled with very competent bureaucratic actors, and the US military is filled with well-trained, loyal, and I think extremely competent officers. And so we should, in a sense, have some sense of continuity with the past, that even when top leadership changes, that not everything changes, and there can be people who will still be helping on NATO armament issues, and people who are still trying to work on the Non-Proliferation Treaty Review Conference, and people will still be trying to work with the International Atomic Energy Agency to have better inspections. All that nuclear infrastructure still exists, and we should be pleased that it works as well as it does. It's not perfect, and there have clearly been problems, but I think on the whole, it's great. The question is that, will this president try to disrupt it? He likes to be a disruptor. So I think the biggest issue here, for example, would be nuclear testing, something I know that you have been interested in. Thus far, the directors of the US laboratories who are asked and are required by law to tell Congress every year whether they believe that new testing is necessary to have a safe and secure nuclear arsenal. Thus far, they have consistently said, no, we do not need to start testing. But there are some inside the Trump camp who say that we should start testing, and that we need to do this for more exotic weapons or for improved understanding of low yield weapons or improved understanding of new design weapons. If the United States could test and no one else would test, I wouldn't object to it. But that's not the way the world works. If we test, others will test, the Russians, the Chinese.
And we've got satellite analysis that shows that the Russian and Chinese are increasing their testing sites. Like there's the James Martin Center has an analysis that says, look at these roads they're building and these new tunnels and these new buildings on the Chinese and Russian nuclear testing sites. They are rebuilding an architecture and creating an architecture to return to testing.
Correct. Correct. And right now, the United States has not ratified the Comprehensive Test Ban Treaty. And the Russians have said that they are withdrawing from their ratification, although they are still following the treaty. So to me, that would be the most destabilizing thing that the United States could do.
Yes.
And I make one last comment about what some people have viewed as a positive statement, which was this idea of an Iron Dome for America. I don't object to having some missile defense capabilities. I think it's a good thing that the North Koreans don't think that they can launch missiles against the United States and get a free ride. That said, what President Trump has called for is a massive increase in that spending. That's going to increase the likelihood that the Russians and the Chinese will increase their offensive weapons because they will fear that our defensive capabilities will be graver. So from a public perspective, I think this is a real interesting problem, is what kinds of limits could we have if we have a arms control agreement? It would have to include defenses, not just offenses. Good to have you join us, Rob.
Thanks for having me. Thanks for having me. And for those of you who I might not know yet, my name is Robert K. Elder, and I'm the president and CEO of Outrider Foundation, and we're one of the partners in this program. And the Outrider Foundation supports journalism and multimedia storytelling about climate change and nuclear threats. So I'm sort of the moderator for the Q&A, so I will get right to them. There's a lot in the queue, so apologies in advance if we don't get to everyone. But there was a really interesting question here about resuming testing in Nevada. And so the question here comes from Lauren Miller. Could you speak to the potential for resumption of nuclear weapons testing in Nevada? Some in Trump's circle, as well as Project 2025, have recently endorsed resuming weapons testing. What are your thoughts on the likelihood and potential impact of this testing?
So I'm glad you brought up Project 2025. That was definitely one of the recommendations of Project 2025. Could this happen? It could. It could. I think the last test we had was in 1992 at the Nevada test site. They couldn't immediately return to testing. Like there'd be work they would have to do to get ready for a test. Some of these tests, take a while to get ready for. We could see an announcement for a test that they're going to begin a test, which could be part of its own stratagem of deterrent signaling to Russia and or China. But then the politics of it would be what would complicate it. Nevadans do not want a return to nuclear testing. And I think this could be like a really good local reporting story, and even a national reporting story. Nevada was a swing state that voted for President Trump in this election, and Republicans very much want to keep in their camp in the Electoral College, and they would like to win those Senate seats. So this would be a complicated decision, and I think what I could see be more likely is they would announce they're going to prepare for a potential test, but maybe but kind of like dither a little bit on actually going through with it, unless there was a radical change with Russia or China, and we were much more likely to be like heading back toward a hot war. But like what would the outcome be? The nuclear fallout, I don't know I can't speak with any kind of expertise about what the technology is today and what the nuclear fallout might be. We used to do testing in the Marshall Islands. That ended in the 1960s. The Marshall Islands are far out in the Pacific. But the nuclear fallout from that, we are still paying payments to the Marshall Islanders as recompense for some of the cancer that developed from that. I think there's still a lot of concern in Congress, including by conservatives, about the cancers being created, the cancers that have developed among people who were close to nuclear weapons sites. So this is going to be a deeply complicated issue for within the Republican Party. You have conservatives who are champions for the U.S. government paying the healthcare expenses of people who were close to the nuclear weapons. Most of the nuclear weapons infrastructure is in the West and in the American South. It's not in the American Northeast, not the big sites.
I would note that the fallout problem is one of a historical legacy from earlier tests above ground. If there's any testing by the United States in the coming years, it will all be underground. It's not entirely risk-free, but the risk of a fallout release is much, much less than it was back when we were just exploding bombs above ground. Now, what's not clear is what would happen elsewhere if the United States made a decision to test, because other countries are looking at the United States, and if we start testing, I think their domestic political debates, the ones that you're highlighting, Rachel, would be very much overturned by a desire that we need to match the United States and we need to move forward too. So I think there's a good, rational, sort of realist reason why the United States should not want to test, because it will encourage other people who are our adversaries to test as well.
Now, this is not just one question. This is several questions. I'm just going to round them up. But it's the question about artificial intelligence and nuclear security. So Los Alamos just said that they are working with OpenAI And I just wanted sort of thoughts and reactions because there's a lot of questions in the queue about this.
Well, my own view is that it's very important to always have a man in the loop on all of these kinds of decisions. But you have to base your strategy in part on warning systems. And where AI can be valuable is in trying to put together a broad set of information about what does this really mean? Is this an attack that's coming? Is it something that's going to happen? Ultimately, I think the Biden administration's AI guidance was right, is that there will always have to be a man in the loop, but that we're going to have uses of AI to help with warning systems, but not with command and control decision making.
Rachel, any thoughts?
Um, there's so many things I don't know, right? Like the amount of things I don't know about AI, I mean, it's vast, and that's deliberately like the what AI can do, what the US, what the military want to keep private. I mean, they're doing that for national security reasons. I would say the publicly available AI models still have too much of a problem rate. I think it's something around 3% that it's making it tricky, and maybe it's come down from where it was last year, but I think the problem, the hallucinations, the bad information that you can see in the publicly available AI models has meant that some businesses just aren't really ready to like use it and like trust it yet, or they'll use it for like some tasks, but then they'll have a human go in and double check it. I can see how, yeah, I just there's so much I don't know, I think, but I think we've also heard people saying that one of the potential low-hanging fruit for a nuclear agreement is countries promising to keep AI out of command and control. That human beings will always be the ones driving that bus. And I think that there's been that is something that the countries could agree to, from what I've read.
Next up is a question from Mark Johnson. And he says, the US is in the middle of a $1.7 trillion modernization of its nuclear arsenal. Should we be pursuing this modernization, or will that severely undermine any attempts to negotiate a new nuclear arms treaty?
I think we historically have not been able to get arms agreements through Congress unless we are promising to some in Congress to have some modernization. So I don't think you should think about this as an either or. That is, arms modernization can be a bargaining chip that can get another country to say, okay, well, if you stop doing that, we will stop doing this, and we will have mutual constraints. That's what worked during the Obama administration, and that is what got us the New START agreement. So I don't think that the evidence of increased spending is by itself a bad thing. I think what's a bad thing is if we couple that with a refusal to have any negotiated settlement and cut back on that spending in a mutually verifiable way with the Russians and the Chinese.
And I think just there's a real political momentum right now toward increasing spending on nuclear weapons, which is going to be hard. As Scott said, it's really hard to get nuclear arms control treaties through Congress. But the number of states that have some kind of role in nuclear weapons, or the delivery systems of nuclear weapons, or missile defenses, it's a long one, and just and it's not comprehensive, but these are some of the states who have a role in it: North Dakota, Montana, Wyoming, Colorado, New Mexico, Texas, South Carolina, Tennessee, California, Nevada, Kentucky, Ohio, Georgia, Alaska, Washington. And that I wouldn't claim that is comprehensive, but all of those states are receiving taxpayer dollars to the tune of hundreds of millions and billions of dollars for nuclear weapons related work. That could increase, and likely will, as part of the reconciliation agreement Republicans are going to be spending this winter and May working on. Numbers for the plus up in defense-related spending are being tossed at around 20 billion, could go larger. I think a fraction of that will be for nuclear weapons. And then I think more money as well in the regular appropriation cycle. Once these dollars begin going out, lawmakers get very attached to them. They get very attached to them, and they have their own kind of fiefdom and lobbyists and experts who work to support that, you know, and make sure that money keeps going. It was one of the reasons why during the Obama administration it was so hard to reach agreement on reducing the number of deployed ICBMs, you know, and it's just expanding from there now.
All right, so we have a few minutes left, and I have one longer question, and then I'm going to go to a lightning round. So this is from Miriam Janari, and she's asking, what are the biggest misconceptions that young people have about nuclear energy and nuclear proliferation, and how can we better educate them to understand the benefits and risks? Additionally, how can we differentiate for the growing demand for clean energy and nuclear security? So again, it's all mixed up in there, but these are two sort of, if not competing, certainly parallel concerns.
So nuclear energy by itself is a neutral thing, right? You know, it's what humans want to do with it, right? It's how the humans are the problem, you know, because we are imperfect, and so there's always the risk of either a catastrophic nuclear reactor meltdown, such as you had in Ukraine, or in Japan, with Fukushima. And then nuclear proliferation can mean the proliferation of weapons, and it can mean the proliferation of the technology used to make weapons, and it can also mean the proliferation of uranium and plutonium and other nuclear elements that can be used to make a dirty bomb. You could theoretically do that from a civilian nuclear energy reactor. Like, I think what's needed is kind of like, you know, like a definition guide of what these things are. Nuclear energy likely does have a very important role to play in climate change, and in 21st century technologies, space travel, all of that. But the proliferation is just as much a part of that as nuclear safety, which is about, you know, making sure there's not a reactor incident. So I just wonder what young Americans, I think young Americans today just are more of a blank slate. Maybe I'm wrong. When I was young, you know, the Cold War was ending, and nuclear definitely had a bad connotation to it. It's since been out of the limelight for a long, long time. Climate change is kind of this big overriding concern. I could see young Americans being more open-minded to nuclear energy, particularly as it's been so long since 3 Mile Island happened. There's just not that kind of instinct, I think, an instinctive reaction to nuclear the way that it used to be.
Yeah, I think the key question here globally, Rob, is can you have the spread of nuclear energy without having the spread of nuclear weapons? And I think the answer is yes, that one can if you restrict the ability of new countries developing nuclear energy, restrict them so that they don't have the ability to produce enriched uranium or to reprocess plutonium, because that's the pathway to get from nuclear energy to nuclear bombs. And it is possible, for example, as happens with Japan, to ship their material elsewhere. Or it's possible, as we do with the United Arab Emirates, to have enriched uranium sent to them and then taken back in the form of plutonium afterwards. So I think that it is possible to have the spread of nuclear power without it leading to the spread of nuclear weapons.
Great. All right, so this is the lightning round. So this is from Matthew Gensel. What are there particular types of missile defenses that are likely to be less destabilizing? And are there particular missile defense investments that would be good for arms control negotiations with Russia? and China with a lower risk of destabilization?
Scott.
And the answer is, I think that land-based interceptors are less destabilizing. I think the idea about having weapons in space that are so-called will be launch capabilities to shoot down in another country looks very offensive. So at least it is possible there could be improvements in land-based interceptor capabilities that could make it harder for countries to attack the United States, but wouldn't be as destabilizing as what the current so-called Iron Dome plan seems to be suggesting.
Great. This is from Davis Winking from USA Today. Both the president and the Secretary of Defense have both referred to North Korea as a nuclear power in recent weeks, leading to an outcry from Seoul. Do you think that the U.S. policy towards the peninsula may soon abandon denuclearization as its official goal? And do you believe that South Korea possesses a real proliferation risks in the years ahead?
So the first question, I think probably. We're probably going to acknowledge North Korea isn't denuclearizing, and that's not going to be the focus of our efforts if we engage with North Korea. Will South Korea proliferate? Will South Korea become a nuclear weapons breakout state? They kind of already are. That will depend on what President Trump does. If President Trump reduces the number of U.S. Soldiers, U.S. troops that are deployed in South Korea, if they renegotiate the basing agreement, I mean, there could be all sorts of things that would make the South Koreans too uncomfortable. I think the ball right now is in the U.S. court as to how that goes.
Great. And so final question, which is a broad question. This is from Todd Hillier. Is there anything that the common person can do to at least try to help?
My good friend and former Stanford colleague was General John Charlie Kashvili, the former chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff. And he was asked at a meeting once at Stanford whether he told his soldiers going into combat, what should they be thinking about? And he said, well, he'd ask them, are you afraid? And they said, no, we're not afraid, sir. We're not afraid. And he said, no, you should be a little afraid. Not afraid enough to paralyze you, but just afraid enough that you don't do something stupid. And I worry that the American public is not afraid enough, and so that they will vote for people who don't know much about these subjects at all or don't care about these subjects. You should be just afraid enough that this should be one of the important things that you use when you decide who to vote for.
I think that is a good place to leave it. So thank you again. Our speakers have been Rachel Oswald and Scott D. Sagan. And thank you again to our partners in today's organizing this conversation. We also appreciate all of you joining us in the audience today. After this webinar, a short survey will follow. We appreciate your help in improving our events by taking a few minutes to answer those questions. And thank you for joining us today, and bye for now. Thanks.